Hello and welcome to the Regenerating Nature podcast. This is our first episode. It's mostly an intro to what we're going to be talking about and what we're trying to accomplish with this podcast, but we do go into a little bit more depth on some of the issues that we're facing in terms of the future of our society and land management and everything that goes along with it, food security, and how the normal homeowner, everybody is involved in the system and how everyone plays a part in the system, not just the people that own the land and are doing the work. There are a couple little audio glitches that happened along the way. If you are listening to this on an audio only platform, just want to make you aware that this video will also be uploaded to YouTube. There won't be a ton of extra footage or graphics in this particular episode, but we do record this live and dump it on YouTube if that's more your thing. And in the future, when we're telling stories or showing graphs or talking about stuff, I will bring those up and patch those into the video just for reference. So thanks again for listening. And if you enjoy this show, please go ahead and like it, subscribe on whatever platform. That lets us know that you're interested in hearing more from us. So thank you again and enjoy. All right. You ready to roll?
Yeah.
All right. Welcome to the Regenerating Nature podcast. This is our first official episode. So this is going to have the long intro to kind of explain what we're all about and what our intentions of this podcast are. And then we're going to get right into it. So I promise that I won't bore you or take up any more of your time than I have to in additional episodes with this intro. But since we're here, we are the Regenerating Nature podcast, where we research, discuss, and employ sustainable ways for humans to promote and protect nature. Why is that so important, you might ask? Because, simply put, we are a part of nature. Our personal health and happiness, along with the future of our planet, are 100% dependent on nature and all that it provides. And the further that we drift from our connection with nature, the worse off our society becomes. So we're here today to help inspire thoughts and actions that make a real difference. I'm your host, Thomas Mlsna, father, husband, provider. My background is in wildlife biology and natural resources, agricultural production, and land use. And I've worked in the outdoor industry for over 12 years. I am the CEO and owner of the Untamed Ambition, a habitat development company that offers consulting and project management to a variety of walks of life. Anyone looking to improve natural habitat, natural ecosystems, and manage them at a productive level, producing sustainable wildlife habitat, unforgettable recreational experiences, diversified income, and food security all at the same time. And I am joined by my co-host, Taylor Henry, a regenerative farmer and realtor with the Compass Realty Group. So, Taylor, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Great intro. Happy to be here. Yes, I'm Taylor Henry. I'm from Southwest Wisconsin, Viroqua, Wisconsin. I've had a lifelong obsession with land, and that's pretty much come from being a city boy. I was raised in the city, but always longed to own land and have land. So yeah, I've acquired recreational and farmland. It's about a 60-acre regenerative operation that we farm cattle, hogs, and chickens. It's also home to Airbnbs, and it's considered an experimental farm that marries new age agriculture and blossoming recreational land that is also home to giant bucks. I've been mentored by Mark Shepard, who's the CEO of Forest Ag Enterprises and the founder of Restoration Agricultural Development. He's the author of Restoration Agricultural. a real world permaculture for farmers. He's also known for his New Forest Farm, and it's a 106-acre perennial agricultural savanna located outside of Viola. I'm also passionate about business and farming along with hunting. And I have started a real estate practice that specializes in working with hunters and farmers. And that has grown a lot in the last year or 2 years with the amount of acreage that has been being sold. And that's kind of the purpose why I'm here. I want to help more people acquire land to start their journey with land ownership, but I also love to help the people who are either investing, trading up to buy more land, and selling their current existing piece, or selling century type farms that have been in the family forever, and making sure that those go to a person that's going to respect them and treat them well.
And that's really why I wanted to start this podcast with Taylor to begin with. I mean, I feel like we are both in a very similar place in life. I mean, not down to the dirty details, but mindset wise, we're in a similar place in life, both starting young families, or raising young families, I should say. But I truly believe that we are facing some significant issues right now in our country and in this world, and it's up to us to change those things. And the power is with the people and how they spend their money. And when you spend your money on land and invest in land, you have a significant impact because you have more control, right? And that impact can be negative, it can be positive. But when you own that land, now you have options to manage that land and earn an income off that land, or earn an income off that land, I should say, because you don't always have to buy land for that purpose. But having the land is key. This whole podcast isn't going to revolve around purchasing land or owning land by any means, but I think it's a goal that we as Americans should all chase at some point in our life, because despite the fact that we're in a country that is labeled free, we're not truly free until we own land and produce our own food on that land for our families. At that point, then you have a lot more freedom, right? But inevitably, if you're dependent on someone else to supply you with your source of nutrition, if you're outsourcing where your actual food comes from, then you are always going to be a slave to that system. And that's really what I want to talk about in this podcast, because food is such an important factor. It is, it's one of the most important things in our lives. And where does that food come from? That food inevitably comes from nature. And at the rate that we are destroying and removing nature from our lives, from the world around us, eventually it's going to be gone. And then we're going to be 100% dependent on a humanized, mechanized, unnatural system for our food. And that, not to jump right into the dark side, but that would be a new form of slavery, or a form of slavery. You know what I'm saying? So that's something I think everybody should be aware of at all times. But from my perspective, I want to save nature far and beyond just, the things that we get out of nature, because nature itself, I mean, obviously we are a part of nature. If it wasn't for nature, we would have not evolved to this point. We would not have had the opportunities that we've had up until this point. But we need to ensure that we're not hitting this threshold or turning around, looking back, and just, running away with things, because it will not end well. Not at all. But that's why I brought Taylor aboard. He's went through the purchasing process. He understands the business side of owning land and getting it to pay for itself. And, that's a lot of what I do with clients as well, is you're always trying to find ways to get that land to pay for itself. I primarily do it because I want to make sure that wildlife habitat is productive at that level that it can pay for itself, so that there's not an option or a reason to remove it, right? If it pays, it stays. So if it's productive and there's no threat, it's self-sustaining on the financial side of things, then there's a lot better chance that wildlife habitat's going to be protected for many generations, and doesn't just succumb to that, oh, corn's up this year, let's clear that spot and plant a couple extra acres mindset, right? So with that being said, I know that was kind of a long-winded intro, but that's kind of in a nutshell, what this podcast is all about. We are constantly looking at ways to basically get more land, get more nature, protect more nature. My side of things is I'm not specifically, targeting people that are buying land or selling land like Taylor's side of things, but I'm working with people that are, they have a stake in land. They're more connected to it. But my argument would be, again, that we all need to be more connected to it, and you don't necessarily have to own land, but owning land gives you more control or more influence, I should say, right, on the outcome of that property, of that land. So it's owning land it's a much greater responsibility than I think a lot of people realize, right? What's your take on that, Taylor?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think so here's the issue with land. I think people in our generation or people our age have a hard time wrapping their mind around buying it, because it's not a physical, tangible asset like a house. And then for whatever reason, we are very into putting money into retirement funds, Roth IRAs, investment accounts, and land does not perform the same way as like commercial buildings do, or apartments and rentals, where it automatically has this kind of cash flow basis in it. But I like to put in people's minds to treat land similar to how you would treat a piggy bank or your retirement account or your investment accounts. If you have extra money that away monthly into an investment account, but then in the same token say that I cannot afford land, you can. It's just you're not looking at it exactly the way that you would look at that investment account, which you have no control over. You have no control over increasing the value of that property or increasing the value of that investment. You have no control over what the market's going to do to it. At least with land, sure, you could say I don't have control over the value of it and what the market's going to do in some ways, but land has consistently held its value and increased its value more than almost any asset in the financial sector. You do have the beauty of real estate is the ability to value add and to increase the value of a property by you putting work into it or you putting your imagination into it, while land being, the best hedge against inflation, which where we are right now is, I mean, we're dead in the center of, big time inflation and recession. Land has been that hedge against that forever.
I thought we were in one of the best economies we've ever had. Jobs are up, gas prices are down. I keep hearing it.
Yeah.
But
I think that's because when I first got started, I wanted to say I want to figure out a way to cash flow land, make essentially cattle and the activities on the land operate in the same way that you would have tenants in an apartment building. I don't think it's that simple for everybody. I think if people look at the land portion as the investment account and then the buildings and the activities that you do on the land, similar to what could possibly make you the return and make you the cash flow, that's probably the best way to look at it. Because most likely people aren't going to start a big cattle farm like I have, where we're getting into year 3 and it finally is profitable, but it's not a cheap thing to get into either.
Correct. And there's a lot of people out there that, they don't have the time to invest in that, obviously, right? If you're going to become a farmer, that's a full-time job, right? So it's very hard to be a part-time farmer. I guess you could call yourself a hobby farmer if you're raising this or that here or there, but a full-time farmer managing the
Well,
logistics involved with,
I don't know. I don't know. I think the way the farming that I do is it's not full. I mean, my full-time job is a realtor and I would say managing the houses and the
yeah.
Airbnbs.
No, I understand that. I mean, let me back up and clarify. You're not going to buy a bunch of cattle and raise them in a way that's beneficial to all parties, right? Healthiest way, best the on the ground, on the land, management wise, improving the land instead of just taking from the land, and doing it profitably, right? You're not going to operate even a small cattle operation without investing some time into it. And the reason I want to
Well,
bring
and
that up is
you're gonna have a hard time wedging in your cost of living in there.
correct, correct. But it all comes down to time, right? It's like life is all about how we manage and where we put our time. And obviously, with what you're doing, there's once you have things established and you have a routine and you get things figured out, and you're incorporating some newer technologies, in the form of automating your pasture systems a little bit. You still have to be there, be invested, check in on those cattle. But you know, no, I shouldn't have said that it was a full-time job, but it's more than just, hey, I'm going to dump these cattle in this pasture at the beginning of the summer. I'm going to pull them from the pasture at the end of the summer. I'm going to bring them home and feed them a bale of hay once a week
Yeah,
throughout the
100%.
winter. Right. So that's why I wanted to clarify. And again, that is, a lot of people do that. And, and that's not always the most beneficial thing, right? I mean, you're still raising high quality animals, but it's not the best for the land. That would be the biggest determining factor. But we'll get into that another time. Again, we're going to discuss all sorts of topics and pull in some guests. I've got a list of some people that I have reached out to. I've got a list of people that I will be reaching out to, and I know Taylor does as well. So, I mean, my goal with this podcast is to bring up topics, discuss topics, things that are on our minds, things that we're doing to overcome certain obstacles in our lives, as we are going, through our own journeys, and hopefully share that, with you, the audience, in a way that, again, either helps you or inspires you or gets you thinking about some of these things and why we're doing them. And, both of us are doing the things that we're doing. I guess I don't want to speak for both of us, but myself personally, I'm doing the things that I'm doing because it's very important to me that my kids and then the next generation has as good or better opportunities in life than we had. But the way things have changed so much in the last few years has really been an eye opener. And I know myself personally, I've started to look back through a lot of other things throughout history, uh, not just specifically politics or anything along those lines, but just how we as humans have changed, altered nature, removed nature, interacted with nature throughout history, and essentially how that interaction has had consequences, right? And things are not looking very good, the path that we're going. And I just, if anything, I'd like to get more people to be more aware of where their food comes from and where their food's going, if more people are not aware of these situations. So, that's really what we want to talk about. But all of these things, the way land is managed with cattle, the way food is produced, the way hunting properties are managed for hunting, all of these things, and also, I don't want to exclude or rule out the people that don't own a property. Again, you don't have to be a landowner. Uh, if you own any land at all, it could be a quarter acre yard or less. Maybe you own or you have an apartment, but you have a balcony or rooftop access. I mean, there's always things that we can do to be better about what's going on with our environment. And most of that comes down to your consumption, right? There's percentage of people in the world that are consumers and consumers only, and there's a percentage of people in the world that are producers, but all producers are going to be consumers to some level, right? They might be consuming all of what they produce, but they're still consumers. But consumers have that control because they're the ones funding the producers. So wherever you're spending your money is, going to promote one thing or another. So if you're spending your money on food that's produced in a way that is good for the land, then that's going to promote that way of life, that way of food production, which is inevitably going to be good for the land. If you're spending your money with food that is produced in a way that is not good for the land, then you're promoting a way of life, a mindset, a procedure, a routine that is ultimately damaging or destroying the land, right? So that's that's really the biggest thing. I mean, if everyone in the world understood that, plain and simple, the world would be a much better place. So how do we get there? Right? Tell me, Taylor. You have the answers. How do we get there?
Yeah, I mean it's starting the conversation and just in education. I mean I didn't know much better. I didn't know really any better before I dove into the reason I got into regenerative agriculture is because I knew I wanted to own land because I loved hunting and I wanted to. It really just came from me being a control freak, not being able to stand, not having control over the property I was hunting, and just the every normal story you'd ever hear about when people are hunting on ask for permission properties. But when you start getting into like soil health and what is happening with our ground, it kind of comes down to the 5 basic principles. And if these 5 basic principles were followed, and if they were just common knowledge that they were taught in our schools, if this is the information that we were getting when we were in elementary school instead of the food pyramid, our world would be in a lot better place. Our farmers would be in a lot better place. And then our food would be in a lot better place. And in turn, we'd be a lot healthier. So
Well,
those
I think that the principles aside, I think the important factor there is that if we were just taught that it starts with the soil to begin with, right?
well, the key thing is education.
Yeah, but just
We were not taught this.
starting with that foundation instead of
Right. Well,
the things that are above.
You're trained to trust and believe your teachers and your parents and your people that gave you the information your whole entire life. Never in a million years would you conceive the possibility that the information was actually the opposite of correct. I mean, that's what we're talking about. It was literally like, look at the old food pyramid, even though they just tried coming out with a updated one that kind of mimics that. Like the food pyramid's insane.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's the opposite of truth, which is, who would have thought that? Who would have thought that that could be possible when you're learning that?
And that's the thing. And, this is the topic of today's episode, beyond the intro, and kind of letting you, the user, excuse me, the listener, get a feel for what we're going to be talking about throughout this podcast. The topic of this episode 1, is our broken system, right? The system is so broken on every level. And I think, the last couple of years expose that dramatically, where these bigger players in the game, the people with all the money, the people that are moving the bulk of the money around the economy in the world, are just blatantly lying about everything to fill up their bank accounts more and more. I mean, we had the biggest shift of wealth in human history ever in the last couple of years. And these people are still pushing the absolute worst practices down our throat. And that's, again, that's why I wanted to do this podcast, so that we just had more of an opportunity to talk about some of these things and what we see. I mean, I tell people this all the time, that I see myself as a frontline conservationist, a frontline environmentalist, right? I'm not out picketing in front of a courthouse with a sign complaining about anything. I'm out identifying problems and finding solutions to those problems on a case by case basis. And my career, my path has led me down doing that in the natural world, right? Everything that I'm looking at has to do with land and native environments. And that's really where my passion is. But I see all these problems and where they all come from. My background is pretty diverse as far as the perspectives that I've picked up along the way. And I see all these problems. And then, like Taylor said, you see all these lies and the things that they're pushing. And then you start following the money, start tracing that back. What is the root of that problem? Well, it's caused by that. Well, why is it caused by that? Well, it's pushed by this company or it's pushed by that. And you work your way all the way back up. And then on the other side of that, it trickles all the way back down through the education system, through academia, through the colleges, all the way down to elementary school, where they don't teach you anything about managing money. They don't teach you anything about soil health. All they teach you is to recycle your fucking plastic water bottles, and that's going to save the world. Or maybe take a shorter shower. Don't let the water run while you're brushing your teeth, and that's what's going to save the world. But they don't ever talk about eating terrible food and where that food even comes from. And I think that's just a topic of conversation more and more and more these days, which is good. It's good to see people having those conversations finally. And again, I think a lot of it was sparked by the last couple of years where you kind of had this tipping point. There's always a certain percentage of our population that didn't trust the government and didn't trust big corporations and were anti these things. And it's funny to me looking back, growing up on a conventional farm, a dairy farm, the people that were bringing up or addressing those issues, specifically environmental issues, were what they were the dirty hippies. Well, that was that crazy hippie person, right? And yeah, I mean,
No,
sometimes
I'm
you
a
look at
dirty
them.
hippie.
Yeah, well, me too. Me too. I mean, it's funny. It's just I shouldn't say it's funny. It's just ironic. But life
I heard
changes, and
it's
again,
it's 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 very
uh,
interesting. It's just, but at some point, I don't know. I think you get older and you realize the world is more simple than what it's led on to be. Um, because that's what this is. It's like it's not hard. This is very simple. But I think people's energy and focus is only captured in like small little milliseconds. So that's why they tell you like recycle and do these things, because they can say that in one sentence. Whereas like make the soil healthy. I mean, it's simple, but it's more complex than just throwing away your water bottle.
well, I think you bring up a good point there, where the short attention span. It's also that short. How do I want to say this? It's the delayed gratification, or the lack of delayed gratification that we have as a society, right? And that's
We're
where
obsessed with instant gratification.
and where does that come from? I mean, it's all driven by the consumer industry itself, right? It's like we want quick and easy food, shitty for us. We want quick and easy information, usually not thorough, sometimes not even true. We want all of the things in our life to either make our life easier or give us more time. For what? So we can hurry home, sit our asses down on the sofa and watch TV. So every person in our household can split off to separate quarters with a separate screen, and they can do their own thing for however many hours in the evening. We're all so disconnected from everything that's going on, but it's all because we want this instant gratification. I think that's a big issue with land management on every level. Is people want instant. They want it to look good now. They want it to produce now. What I deal with all the time is there's some pretty dramatic investment opportunities available if you buy the right property. So if someone is specifically looking for an investment opportunity, weighing out the option of buying land. The right properties, as you know, Taylor, is they can produce a significant amount of income, mostly through farming, but also recreational opportunities and other things if they're managed correctly. Most of the time, you're not going to have situations where those things produce in year one, right? Even if you buy land and you enroll the whole thing in CRP, where the government's going to pay you to plant grass on your property, you're not eligible
That's
for that
still that's
immediately.
still a year out. Yeah.
Exactly. So, that's
I mean,
hard
we're
for a
here.
lot of.
There's a reason. Like the quickest way to make a buck on owning land is renting it out to the current farmer who's probably farming it.
Correct.
And that's why those things never stop.
Correct. But I have a solution for that. I've been employing for a couple of years, and it seems to be working well. It does come down to getting that property owner, that landowner, to take away a little bit of that land from the farmer, and then we manage that differently, and then that area starts to produce at a higher level where it can overcompensate for the rest of it, and then you start to manage all of it. Then it kind of has this cascading effect, right? But it's all like, and usually I have that conversation with the landowner, kind of put things into perspective for them. Like, hey, are you willing to give up a few acres here or there? How much are you actually getting paid to rent that tillable land to the farmer? $100 an acre, maybe $200 an acre. So you can't afford to give up $600 that year on that property. Maybe sometimes, maybe not. Sometimes you can, but it's all, again, where are you putting that money? Where are you putting your time?
The weirdest thing I see, the biggest thing I've seen, is they just don't want to tell the farmer. Like they don't want they like think that they're being
they're being
like
generous
rude.
to. Oh yeah, no, I see that all the time too. They don't
Like
want to.
if they were to be like where there's this very like simple exchange of money where it's like you get this outlined acreage, okay, and then that person gets to do that, and it's like if you just go and take 3 acres away, the majority of people that I tell that to do that to, it ends up coming down to the fact that they don't want to go have that conversation.
Yeah, well, that's
Or they like made a like some of the weirder ones I've ever seen is like my grandpa made a deal with that
yes.
farm 20 years ago, and they're still like it's crazy.
Still getting paid the same amount per acre too. I know that's exactly it. And honestly, I, it's amazing to me how often in my line of work, consulting on some of these properties, that will be a new idea to someone. It's like, hey, have you ever thought about talking to that guy and taking away some of
Yeah.
that land?
You didn't
It's like,
sign a blood
yes.
contract when you got it. Yeah.
So, but again, short term versus long term, if people have a little bit more delayed gratification, and obviously I understand the financial side of things, but a lot of times if you're willing to, or if you have a better plan going into it, when you buy a property, if you're willing to wait a little while with your management practices, they generally are going to produce at a higher level once they're established. And that's a big case right there with permaculture, right? Is when you're dealing with like a perennial orchard, that once it's established, that thing is going to produce in a self-sustaining way for the foreseeable future with little to no inputs. And if it's managed correctly, your management practices can actually pay for themselves, i.e. cattle, i.e. having a good plan, good timing, all those things that come into play. Then your management practices essentially pay for themselves or produce secondary income on that land. There's a lot of potential there.
The biggest thing, the easiest thing to say for like making money on land, because there's a way, it's stacking enterprises. That's why the permaculture, the multi-layered, the multi-level type production is so popular, because you're stacking enterprises on top of each other. So like,
yeah, that's why it makes perfect sense financially. I love the idea because now you have a diverse ecosystem that doesn't require all the chemicals to sustain itself, right? Because now you're working with nature, having that balance, and the different, what Taylor's talking about there with the multi-layer, multi-level, he's talking about, basically farming different levels of solar energy, essentially,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Your
and that's really what it
ground,
comes down to.
yeah, a bare egg field. And what people look at as farming, they look at that as a two-dimensional object when it doesn't have to be. It's not just a flat piece of ground. You can build things on top of it that will actually produce income. And we do the same thing with cover, like you do the same thing with your cover crop blends as well. Like what is growing straight up in the air, tall and narrow, like corn or sorghum, but then what grows at the bottom layer that kind of spreads out and has more
Creates
surface mass, like
more ground cover.
clover and soybeans, like those things grow together. Well, weird. The soybeans grow up the corn stalk. Why? Well, the bean wants something to reach on, grab onto, and grow up. Well, those things don't work together, right?
They work real
Well, they
well,
do.
especially
Yeah.
because the
Oh, and
bean
then
is a
and then you
nitrogen
mentioned
fixer and the
yeah.
corn is a nitrogen eater. So you
Yeah.
literally have one plant feeding another plant, and that's the beauty of a system. And that's when I was talking earlier about how a certain percentage of our population are consumers and a certain percentage are producers, every system has a balance of producers and consumers, right? And again, everything that produces also has to consume something, right? There's no perfect system. You have to have input before you can have output. Right now with our society, we're at this point where we have significantly more consumers than we have producers, and that doesn't work in systems. That doesn't work in a sustainable natural system. And no matter how much we want to fight it and say that we can build this or invent this or print this, we're part of nature, and if we don't obey the balance of those natural systems and give back as much as we take, the clock's ticking. I mean, it makes so much sense. It's just 100% logic, right? It's like it might not be in this generation, might not be in the next generation, might not even be in the generation after that. But if we are part of this system and we are taking more than we're giving back, the math does not line up. And the quality of life goes down as that pendulum swings, or that those scales tip out of balance, right? The quality of life goes down. We're seeing it all over the world in mass extinctions with different animal species. And I'm not here arguing climate crisis, climate change, global warming, but we are, without a shadow of a doubt, dealing with some significant environmental issues due to the things that we as human beings are doing. And most of it is, well, all of it really comes down to how we are utilizing the land, because that land has been cycling carbon on this planet for the entire eternity of this planet, for the entire life of this planet, in one way, shape, or form. There's been some mega disruptors throughout the timeline, but that's what's cycling. Everything that has evolved over time has evolved in this system of cycling nutrients, cycling carbon. And we have been taking and taking from that system and not putting anything back. And that is where our issues are coming from. Would you?
I think, yeah, oh yeah. I think, and here's the easy way for me that I like to say to people. Imagine a cake, right? If you left the earth alone, the earth would automatically add layers to the cake, and you'd end up with a 20-layer cake that you'd be able to cut into and eat at some point. What we have been doing essentially is like we started with like 15 layers of that cake when we hopped on here and we started doing some crazy stuff to the ground to support our overpopulation. And now we're stripping layers away. So we're sitting here with like a 3-layer cake now. Well, we started with a 15. We looked up all the way to the ceiling, this giant cake sitting here, and we've carved. We're all the way down to like we're getting to the point of no return. Where like at some point you get down to layer 2 and then layer 1, and then there's no way, because you have to think about it. Like it builds from below and builds from above, right? Well, if there's nothing above, there's nothing for the ground to build on then. So we have taken that all away by not just being simple. So it's like when people coin like sustainable agriculture, we've beyond the point. We can't really do sustainable anymore because we can't just break even. We have to build back. We have to regenerate and restore. And the big part of that is allowing the ground just to do what the ground does while we are still getting off the ground what we need.
Can I? You just reminded me of something. Give me a second here. I gotta find this. I wrote down some notes. I saw this is news. I think it might have been 60 Minutes. Was it 60 Minutes? Anderson Cooper or some shit. Interviewing Bill Gates on climate change and the hypocrisy of his mindset, where he's everything that he does humanitarian wise, he claims is in the name of climate
Saving
change or saving the world in the face of climate change. And but yeah, he's flying all over the world in his private jet and all the things that he's doing. But he says that he offsets those things where he's
I disagree. I think he's the only thing that I've ever heard him say that's good is that he says that we're overpopulated, which I agree with. We are.
I 100% agree. That's probably a whole nother podcast to talk about that, because people need to understand there is a carrying capacity of this world. With every single wildlife population, there's a carrying capacity. It is unrealistic to think that we can keep growing and growing and growing as a population and maintain the same quality of life or even have a future ahead of us if we keep growing. I mean, if you look at nature, every single population in nature, once it becomes overpopulated, nature either resets it or dramatically knocks it back. And I'm not saying that. Well, I'm just going to leave it at that. But
that is also the most simplistic version. That is the most simplistic version on how we can fix farming too. Because rule number one should be, what can this ground maintain?
Yes.
While also giving back, can we do? And not just taking stripping. Right. Because each farm has a carrying capacity for the amount of animals that can stay on that farm. Same thing we talk about with, you can talk about it with deer hunting too, is when those deer populations get way over what the carrying capacity is for that area, antler size shrinks down, overall health of the deer herds shrinks down, and then all of a sudden either a disease or some type of natural thing evens the playing field.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's why, the CWD thing really bothers me with how the outdoor community in general has reacted to it, where you have this divide of people that are following the science, following what people are saying, taking precautions, but still moving forward. I don't actually think there's been a huge ick factor involved with CWD. Most hunters keep hunting, and I test my deer just because if I can get quality data, I'm going to get quality data. To me, it's like, I'm just going to keep killing deer and testing deer. And if I have a CWD positive, it's not going to be the end of the world to me. But if if myself and my neighbors kill 10 deer a year, 20 deer a year, and we test them all, if we never have a positive, that's best case scenario. If we have a couple positives, but we always just have a couple positives, say we have 20% of the deer tested every year come back positive, but for 10 years it stays at 20%, then we know it's there, but we know it's not spreading and it's not as much of an issue, as potentially still an issue, but not as big of an issue as, the sky is falling mentality that some people had. But if we don't test at all, and if we're just ignorant, that's, there's a huge population of people in this industry that either just put on the tinfoil hat with CWD, or you just ignore it altogether and don't ever address it. That's a bigger problem, because, you can't deny it until it becomes a very, very serious issue. But to your point, from a biological standpoint, we are exposing our deer to significant diseases, the way that we are managing our herds, the way that we are managing properties. What you're saying, we're pushing it far beyond the carrying capacity by providing all this food during certain times of the year, not necessarily enough cover, but also any form of management practice that is trying to concentrate deer in certain areas very consistently can have that potential of disease transmission, right? Food plots aren't nearly as bad, especially if they have healthy soil, because we know through science and research that healthy soil breaks down a lot of pathogens and a lot of the bad stuff. But concentrating on even smaller areas, feeding them piles of corn, mineral sites, I'm not saying that that's how CWD is being transmitted. I'm just saying that if there was a easily transmittable, communicable disease circulating through our whitetail population, it would be very easy for it to spread just beyond the normal biological activity of a deer, making scrapes, peeing in scrapes, licking up pee from other deer and scrapes, stuff like that. We're still setting them up because we're pushing that carrying capacity. So it's unrealistic. We're managing our hunting properties at unrealistic carrying capacities, which inevitably hurts the quality of the deer, which is why we're really truly managing the properties, right? People manage because they want a trophy experience. They want the highest caliber of animal possible, which, gets a bad name or bad reputation in the non-hunting public because we're managing for trophies. But really, to me anyway, that trophy class animal is a product of a trophy class native ecosystem, right? You have a healthy, super healthy native ecosystem. You have an abundance of wildlife, and whitetail deer are native wildlife to our area, and they will thrive in those situations. So, it's very, very possible to manage your property for big deer and healthy deer, but not put them in a position where they're vulnerable to disease. And
it's literally the same thing. Like if I'm grazing cattle and if they are getting too far ahead of where they need to be because I just don't have enough ground for them, whether it's because there's a drought or if I overestimated the amount that can be fit in a certain area, you manage them by taking them out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that,
absolutely, you either have to increase your pasture size or reduce your herd size. And obviously
there's no in between. There's not like I can go stick a trough out there with corn and we'll just make do.
Well, some people do that and that doesn't work.
Right. Yeah.
Well, right. And that's the thing.
It's just letting the ground speak to you and the animal speak to you.
So basically what you're saying is a lot of hunters are managing their deer herd like they manage a beef herd, neither of which are healthy for the beef nor the deer, right?
Yeah. I mean, I get it. Like the math becomes much simpler if you can just say I can have this many animals, I feed them this thing.
Yeah, it costs me this much to dump feed in there, and I know it absolutely does.
Even though it's not very profitable, it's simple math. Whereas like, what is 1/8 of an acre? What's the square footage, and how much of that? How long does it take for 5 cattle to consume that area? And then what is overgrazing, or what is not grazing it enough? What's not enough disturbance?
Yeah.
What's too short of a period of rest? What's too long of a period of rest? What does no rest do? What does no rest look like? And what does that do to the ground? It's
well, no rest and too much rest are equally, well, I shouldn't say equal, but they both,
I would take too
impacts.
much, but yeah, they both are negative. Like, okay, because we're talking about the succession stage of infancy, right? Like grass and pastures are just the beginning of the first successional stage. I believe in those systems for them to be thriving at the most abundance is if we are setting them back consistently, but not constantly.
Well, and when you're talking about a wildlife property, there's obviously certain types of wildlife that have niches in more mature forest stands and whatnot. But most of the wildlife that we pursue, whitetail deer specifically, but also, turkeys and any animal you're trapping, even songbirds, we're pursuing them just for aesthetics and, bird watching, stuff like that. all that wildlife that we pay the most attention to thrives on early succession as well, and some type of
Yeah.
regeneration. So that, that's an obstacle and an issue that I see with the outdoor community and how they're managing their habitat right now is, if you don't have a plan, you can't just mechanically reset the regeneration time and time again without some issues, because your nutrient cycling isn't in sync with your carbon breakdown, your carbon cycling, right? So where, like, when you run it through an animal, that's the best case scenario. That's how things really evolve so rapidly. That's how you build that soil. A cow eats a blade of grass, processes it, turns a fair amount of it into protein, turns most of the rest of it into fertilizer, and a little bit of it goes up in the air, and that gets cycled back through the system.
The most important thing is you're allowing the environment underneath the ground to continue to grow.
Correct.
So when a cow comes up and nails a piece of grass at the right time, when it's just before it gets fully mature, that sends down sensors to the root that say, hey, we're injured up here. We got an issue. We have got to start putting some more energy to regrow up here. And the root's like, okay, I'm gonna go crazy. And it's growing down into the soil further. I mean, the most awesome thing about grass is how deep those those tap roots go. And that's what holds our ground together, right? That's what's so awesome about grass. What's awesome about perennial forage. But if that animal was constantly hammering that plant, boom, 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 it messes up the communication between the top of the plant to the root system.
Yeah.
That's why we
time never allows that plant to really do
doesn't recover
much. Yeah.
Well, it doesn't. Like when that plant's recovering and the roots are sending all this energy up for that plant to regrow. That's the magic. That's what's awesome. That's where you hear about the soil communicating with each other, and where we have all the biology taking place into the ground. And then on top of that, having the actual mass on top of the ground, which is then going to feed the cattle the next time they're through.
And the essential part of this system we're talking about is the cattle, right? It is a large animal.
Any ruminant
animal, but larger animals cover more ground to, and they're more controllable in this type of system as well, right? You're not waiting for them to graze through an area like a herd of buffalo. You're timing things perfectly. Do you know, this is kind of off topic, but actually not off topic, but you know that they're within the next couple of years they will be reintroducing woolly mammoth into Siberia. They've successfully
is that possible?
Cloned. They've
okay.
The Asian elephant is genetically, it is like 99% identical to woolly mammoth, and they found like frozen blood in permafrost that they, multiple different subspecies of woolly mammoth, or what are they, Pleistocene? Is that the actual name of them? Like, Google that.
You're the biology major. Yeah, and you guys will realize it when you listen to more of these. Like, I am actually obsessed with cattle. I think they are the greatest thing to ever be placed on this earth. They absolutely work perfectly with the earth, and they also work perfectly with our bodies and they are the managers of land. Like, my big push this year, and what I'd love to see is we get to where we have contract grazing as part of a CRP program, because in the CRP guidelines and bylaws, whatever you want to call them, they don't allow grazing, which is a mistake. They don't allow it all the time. I think it's like every other year or something.
Every 3 years, once every 3 years.
Is it every 3?
Yeah,
that's ridiculous.
Yeah,
it's stupid. But to my last dying day, I'm gonna get that changed to at least allow it once a year.
Well, I'll work with you on that, because I've actually put some feelers out there too. I mean, there's a few things in our government programs that need to be readdressed, and I feel like, again, like we need to start turning things around one way, shape, or form. And I guess the listener doesn't have to worry about this stuff if guys like you and I are worrying about this stuff, but they should be able to understand or be educated on why we want to make those changes. But I need to take a leak. So let's pause this for a second. All right. Sorry about that. I'm trying really hard to drink a lot more water these days. It's it's the hardest
Why
thing
you weren't doing that well?
with
Like
water.
how many? Like
I'm
how much you trying to drink a day?
well, my problem is I during hunting season specifically, I get myself kind of conditioned. I condition myself to take my shits really early in the morning, and I condition myself to not drink a ton of water during the day because then if I'm out in the woods, I have to pee all the time, and also can't, I don't want to carry gallons of water with me out in the woods to
Yeah,
begin with. So, I mean, I sat, I don't even remember now, probably 10 or 15 all day sits this fall. And, a lot of it just came down to the fact that I've got poor access issues in some of the better pinch points on the farm. So I would slip in there and, maybe maybe it wouldn't be the best spot for a morning hunt, but it would be a really good evening spot on that particular day. But I couldn't get in there in the afternoon because the doe's bed so close, and there's not good way to get in there. So I just go in and set up all day. But anyway, I got myself to where I wasn't drinking a ton of water, and then when I combine that with being active, now that I'm
and
out
cold.
walking properties and cold or at home. Actually, the worst is when I'm at home and I'm staring at a computer screen all day. I get just wicked headaches if I don't drink enough water. But it's hard to, I really got to pound water. So I set a whole pitcher of water and I just
Nice.
fill that thing up, trying to do two of them a day. But
I've been trying to drink 5 of these.
yeah, that's
They're
good.
32 ounce, whatever, like 100 and some ounces. But
Yeah. Well, that's good. So what were we talking about? Um, yeah, I mean, large animals on the landscape is essential. And, I guess to kind of try and bring this thing back around and wrap it up so that it's not too terribly long, though I do feel like I feel like we're probably never going to hit that target length unless we are just sick of talking to each other or talking in general. But I mean, just to kind of bring that back around, having large animals on the landscape as part of this nutrient cycling system is what nature perfected. That was the system that nature perfected. I have this conversation with my clients all the time. I basically the way I see it is since since humans, you could argue since humans were introduced into North America, the soil conditions have been degrading steadily, but obviously at a significantly accelerated rate once white settlers hit the Americas and removed the last of the true megafauna from the landscape, that being the buffalo. Prior to that, there were tons of large animals that grazed across the landscape, and woolly mammoths. One of the reasons why they want to introduce those woolly mammoths back, and this is a real thing. You should look it up. It's actually incredibly fascinating. I really like it because I have young kids, and my 5-year-old son's at that stage in life where dinosaurs and everything extinct is super super cool, and I hope he stays that way forever. That's how I am. I mean, I was obsessed with dinosaurs when I was a kid. But Pleistocene Park, I think, is the name of it, and they've successfully cloned blood or used blood from frozen woolly mammoths, clone them with Asian elephants, and I think they have a fetus in utero right now in an elephant. But the gestation period for elephants and woolly mammoths is 24 months. So it'll take
I was
2
gonna say
years for
it's
this thing to
super
be
long,
born.
right?
Yeah. But their goal, I forget what the target date is, but their goal is to have 600,000 of these things roaming the tundra in Siberia because they, I mean, they've been doing studies up there as of late with, I think, buffalo and maybe cattle or some other large hoofed animals, and showing how the impact of having those animals on the landscape is building the soil back from being tundra, which is not really sustaining productive vegetation, uh, building it back into grasslands. And woolly mammoths and elephants in Africa are the same way. So woolly mammoths, I forget now multiple subspecies throughout the world, but they were very prevalent in North America, which would essentially be the same as an elephant in North America, but they have hair. Excuse me. They have hair that keeps them warm and longer tusks that allow them to dig through snow and whatever they need to dig through to get the food that they eat. But on the landscape, they play a valuable role because when they move through these landscapes, certain times they just bulldoze trees over with their head and create disturbance, open up the
Oh, really?
canopy. Yeah, so they're an essential
Are
part of
they
that, and
ruminants?
they are, I believe. Yeah, they're I don't know. I'm excited because when you can turn to your 5-year-old son who's fascinated with that type of animal or with animals in general. I mean, I guess he's only 5, so he hasn't really understood the fact that how long the timeline of events actually is. 10,000 years ago these animals were removed from the planet. But when you can look at them and be like, hey, in our lifetime we are probably going to get to see a woolly mammoth in person. I mean,
Well,
that's
for how long ago was it? Were they extinct? 10,000?
I think so. I mean,
Yeah, that's crazy. That's crazy. That means that there isn't even, yeah, that is crazy.
yeah, it's insane. How long ago did they go extinct?
And they went extinct from hunting, right? Or did they go extinct from an event? Did they go extinct from the 10,000 a year ago thing? Like
The
there was
that
like an event
that meet
10,000 years ago that,
that like potential meteoroid or meteor that hit that what is that, the
yeah, somebody was on Rogan's podcast recently and they were discussing that, but they were essentially putting a case in on how they believe the start of humans were much earlier than what
yeah
we believe they are.
all the Graham Hancock was talking about that, right?
Yep.
Yeah, the younger Dryas period or something, I think is what they call it, but or I could be completely off on that. But yeah, I think the best theory is that when the climate shifted dramatically due to this event, the mammoths just didn't have enough food. That was a big part of
Mm.
it. But people hunted them. I don't think that that's a pretty big animal to take down with primitive weapons. So I think it would take a lot of hunting to overhunt them, obviously. But yeah, there was a lot that happened during that last event, which is super cool that these guys are digging up that information now. There's been a lot of information coming out that goes against all of the previous recorded events or previous theories that these archaeologists and everything have come up with, and they're fascinating. And that's science, right? We have better technology, better satellite imagery. We can get whole new perspectives on things now, and we can drill deeper. We can test down to more details for different elements and stuff. I mean, it's insane to me when they can go take a rock sample up in these mountains and find evidence that there was sea life there at one point in time. And not saying that that mountain was below, well, it would have been, yeah, saying that it would have been below sea level at one point, and then obviously the topography changed, the plates shift, and mountains get bigger and smaller, stuff like that. But it's just crazy what we can test for now. So there's a lot. Again, I just feel like, and I don't know, I always hit this point where I often overthink things, but it's like, are we just at a point in our lives, like maturity wise, where we're more aware of the things around us and more aware of things around the world? Or are we at a point as a society, or this generation specifically, where a lot of these truths are being exposed and a lot of previous truths are now being challenged? And that's where, like all this stuff with history, Graham Hancock's a perfect example. A lot of archaeologists hate him because his theories are completely different from what the mainstream theory has been forever, with, when the human civilizations that we know, started essentially, or how far back they actually date. And he's talking hundreds of tens of thousands of years earlier than what was previously anticipated. But it's the same thing with our food systems, right? All the truths are coming out. You know, it's not it's not good for you to eat this or that that's been pushed by these companies and corporations and government for how long. You
Well,
know,
as
even
far as
the
the realizing like what I think our generation is the first generation to see the ramifications of the food production model that got started back in the um industrial era.
well,
So like
we're not just seeing it, we're
we're like this.
experiencing it, right?
Yeah, we're taking it on way harder than our generation above us. The biggest thing with the food industry is it changed in the 40s and 50s whenever the industrial age started, where they needed to feed more mouths and more people needed the on the line and create cars and create whatever goods and services, and more people left the farm and technology came, and then we started mass producing food, because I think the population from like 1920 to like 1960 like 4x'd in the world or something. And we can get better numbers on that. But when that stuff started happening, when technology got to the point where we were mass producing food with chemicals and with machinery, that then started getting ran through our grandparents and then our parents and then us. Now they're seeing with herbicide and all the other chemicals that these types of things get embedded into us. And then as we move down a generation, they become more severe. So
Correct.
that's why our generation is dealing with more, gluten intolerance. We're dealing with more. I guess here's a theory, and I support this theory. More autism, more just medication. Not to mention that as a whole and as a generation, we're being medicated more than we were before. So I think this is a generation that has to stop things from the down, essentially like a snowball rolling downhill that's not going to stop. And I don't necessarily blame our parents. I don't necessarily blame our grandparents. They didn't have the same reactions to these things that we are having. And what we're seeing, you talk to people our age who have kids, when they're 5 years old and they have severe gluten intolerances where they're puking and they can't even ingest that food.
Or they have cancer.
That's not, yeah. I haven't gone down the cancer. It's more,
but it's all related. It's all,
yes.
and cancer is, I mean, not to oversimplify it, but oftentimes it's intolerance to certain chemicals, right? That intolerance to the chemicals in your body creates some reaction within your body that is negative. It creates a growth in your body that is negative, and that's reacting to certain levels of chemicals. And some people react to them differently than other people. Some people store certain types of chemicals in their body more so than other people. But it's not their fault. It is not, it's not the generation above us. It's not their fault that we're in this position. It's the fault of a handful of individuals, the companies that pushed it. Because I think about this all the time. The current agricultural practices are very clearly not beneficial to the future of our planet. Very clearly, without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, if you can realistically look at how most land is farmed, where there's 100% synthetic inputs and outputs, that's it, right? There's no nutrient cycling. Everything's mechanized. Everything's chemicals, herbicides, fungicides, pesticides, all these biocides, all these poisons. You're literally dumping poisons on top of your food to farm it, right? How is that in any way, shape, or form beneficial to the planet, that we know without a shadow of a doubt that the soil, the healthy soil, is living soil and you're killing it all the time? So how can you look at that and say that's beneficial? You can't. But it's not the farmer's fault. It's these big companies that profited and are still profiting off of all these chemicals, because they're the ones that train the farmers at the end of the day, right? It's like, if you're a farmer working your ass off to produce commodities, when someone comes along and says, hey, I can save you a ton of time and ensure that you're going to have this crop turn out this way, all you have to do is spray this shit on it. Yeah, of course you're going to do that, right? I think we, especially in this country, as Americans, should have a reasonable expectation to trust the government agencies that are overseeing the health and safety of our population. But if anything has been more obvious and completely opposite of that, it's the last 2 years of our lives, when the government can just blatantly lie about shit, and these different 3-letter organizations can verify or allow or recommend or certify shit that we know is absolutely not good for us. I mean, how are you supposed to trust those people? But again, it's not our parents' fault. They just were led down this path, and now
Well, and think about how they consumed information. All of their information they had consumed was curated and controlled.
correct.
Whereas now with technology, we have the ability to go search for answers. And it goes both ways. You have the ability to go find some crazy ass ideas too that are not right. But
Absolutely.
that's why we just need more people to use common sense, and then like look more in depth at topics and
Ask
not just
questions.
superficial.
Ask questions. That's I've lived my life that way. I mean, everything that I've ever been successful in or overcame some sort of obstacle that was challenging to be successful at something came through asking questions and figuring out answers. The information that we consume is a perfect example of that. And it probably, that it's what's pushed down your throat a lot of times is not usually the best thing. And that's why I personally don't follow much or any content consistently. Like, if someone's just like cramming stuff down your information pie hole, right? Like they're pushing all this information on you daily, free information, then you're the product, right? So they're doing that to persuade you to do one thing or another. Now, a lot of times it's not negative at all, right? They're educating you on a product or a service or something that's beneficial to you. And they're doing that because they've created this product or service to be again, a benefit to you and the world in general. But there are a lot of companies out there, unfortunately. There's a lot of products out there, unfortunately, that are not good for you. They're not good for the environment. They're just highly profitable to produce. And then they convince you that you should buy them and use them. And it's just kind of a downward spiral from there. But again, it's not their fault, but man, we've got a lot of ground to make up at this point. The research,
we do.
all the information that's out there though is valuable. And again, we just got to get more people to think about it first and foremost. And that's why we're here having this conversation today, hoping that we can reach 5 or 6 people.
just to make people aware. Like, here's one thing I never even got close to understanding before I started learning about this stuff. It's like, if you think of soil as a living breathing specimen or animal or whatever, would you ever go take a cow, lay it down, and just drag a disc or spray it full of a burning chemical to reset it or to do something to it?
Well, and
I don't think anybody would.
You say that.
Well, some people would, but
there's more living organisms in the top 2 inches of soil than there is in the entire planet combined.
Well, 98% of the living organisms are in the top 2 inches of the soil.
Yeah. And we have, how much of our country right now is covered right now? We're nearing the end of January. So what percentage of our country right now is full of dead, sterile, lifeless soil? Right now, it's a significant amount. And that's actually that's what I was getting at. Then I kind of got sidetracked. But when I saw that interview with Anderson Cooper and Bill Gates, calling him out as a hypocrite on climate change, and then Bill Gates goes on to say that he's offsetting his carbon footprint by spending lots of money on biofuels for his jet and supporting this company that's creating these machines that can pull carbon out of air, extract carbon from air, and inject it into the ground. And my first thought was like, this right here sums up why we are where we are today. People with money and influence, to go hand in hand, are just pushing narratives that are going to benefit them financially and not benefit the planet. It's like you're talking about inventing or supporting a company that's inventing a machine and a system that can pull carbon from the air and put it in the ground. I say that again. You're inventing a machine that can pull carbon from the air and put it in the ground. What the fuck are we doing? That's what plants are for. That's what trees are for. That's what shrubs are for. They're pulling carbon from the air. They're putting it in the ground. And then we're cycling it with the cattle and we're producing food. So I saw that and I was just like, man, this is very telling.
Well,
right?
Bill Gates is the exact example of, number one, a lunatic, but he is essentially a piece of everything, right? So he knows that buying land is a smart investment. He's like the top landowner in the world. He could choose to do good things with that land. He is not. He's choosing to do monoculture, food production. His excuse, I need to feed the world. Okay, fine. Here's my theory. Those people, they take advantage of owning the land. So he's taking advantage of owning the land. He's taking the financial advantage of that. He's taking the financial advantage of the food product being created. I'm sure he owns a piece of where that food is going and how it's sold. He gets a chunk of that. And then guess what? He also sells vaccines and medicines. Well, weird. Who needs more vaccines, medicines, and just general help? The people who ate the food that you just created.
Yeah.
It's like,
here's the funny thing. So I jotted this down. This isn't complete because I was just curious. I mean, this was literally like a 4:00 on Sunday morning adventure, but I did just rough math on this. So Bill Gates currently is the largest owner of farmland in our country. At sitting at the most recent number I could find is right around 270,000 acres of farmland. And we know, we can reasonably assume that he's conventionally farming that, right? Because he wants everything mechanized, monoculture.
100%. He's not even doing organic.
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, I'd be surprised if there's but a handful of humans even involved in his operations, right? Everything is GPS driven as much as possible. And if not now, in the future, that is his plan without a shadow of a doubt. Everything will be mechanized, ran as efficiently as possible, as efficiently as possible. So monoculture, sterilized environment, zero biodiversity, 100% monoculture, sterile soil, right? When you look at the math on that, okay, again, we're talking about a guy who's boasting that he's supporting the invention of a machine that can pull carbon from the air. Direct air extraction, direct air capture is the technical term for that. So if you look at the average organic matter in soil for conventionally farmed cropland, it sits at right around
1%,
2 to 3%. And I went back and I looked at some soil samples from a couple of farms that I was on in Missouri this last year that were really bad, like really, really bad cropland. And, thankfully my clients purchased them and we're converting them back into native wildlife habitat, but it's going to take some time because the soil is so depleted. Right. But the average organic matter in conventionally farmed soil is sitting at right around 2 to 3%. Now, Gabe Brown took his farm from just under 2% to 6% organic matter in, I think, 20 years. And he's out in North Dakota. And he did that through regenerative practices, cover cropping, perennial plants, perennial pastures, and cattle, cattle.
While still being a pretty big crop farmer.
Yeah. Corn and soybeans. In fact, his yields were county average or county highs, right? He had the highest.
Yeah, he was production. Above county average.
Correct. So that's 4% increase. We'll just say roughly 4% increase. Now, if you do the math on that, a 1% increase of organic matter on 1 acre of land equates to 18.35 metric tons of carbon pulled from the air. That's where it came from, right? Pulled from the air, put into the ground by nature's invention of a plant, not a machine. If you look at I forget now if I found, where are my notes here? Oh, here it is. So right now, the latest, at least what I could find, and again, bear in mind, this was 15 minutes on Google. It wasn't extensive research. But the latest article I could find on direct air capture, i.e., the machines that Bill Gates is promoting and supporting, the latest information I could find was that one of these machines, the most productive machine currently out there, can remove, get this, 0.01 metric ton of carbon per year. Do you understand what I'm saying? So take a 1% increase of organic matter on all the farmland that Bill Gates owns. If he were to switch today, if Bill Gates called me today and we put together, I'm saying we because 270,000 acres is a lot, so I would subcontract you to help me with this, Taylor. But if we put together a long-term plan for his property to farm this in a more regenerative way, he could still cash crop it, right? He could cash crop it on a rotational cycle. You wouldn't be getting the same yields annually. You would, but across a broad spectrum, you would have to rotate your land, especially at the current state it's in. But if you were to increase, well, I didn't. This is where my math ended. But if you take 18, what's 18 times 270,000? You don't have to do the math on that to understand that it's a fucking lot, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a 1% increase. So if he increased that by 4% over the next 10 to 20 years by following regenerative practices on soil health, that's a lot more carbon than what you're going to pull from the air with a machine that also requires carbon and energy to produce and also requires carbon and energy to operate. And then it also creates these hunks of carbon that are unusable by anything within the ecosystem once they're injected back in the ground. So again, back up to a more reasonable method of extracting carbon from the environment, putting it into the ground. You could do that with cattle, and the byproduct of that would be food, good, clean, healthy food for the American population.
Well, what are you going to use to poison everybody with?
Correct. I mean, at that point,
you got it. That's the problem. Look at the business model. It's not only enough to monetize the front end product. You have got to slam the door shut and really hammer down monetization on the back end. And in order for that back end product, the medicine and the vaccines, to really do well, you need to make sure the front end product is making people sick. I mean, it's the oldest lesson in business in the world. Make sure your front end product is cheap, easy to give away, and it doesn't fully solve the main issue. Or in their situation, it's directly causing the issue that will then solve the most monetization and the most profitable product they have on the back end. It's just these guys can wait 30, 40 years.
Yeah. Well,
that is absolutely insane. And the thing with Gabe Brown's place too in North Dakota is those numbers have even, if people are doing that in actual, like the considered, like, I don't know, with like the agricultural belt where we have the best and most fertile soils in the country, those results are quicker, and you even get to where people are having like 10% organic matter.
Because the climate allows that carbon to cycle significantly faster. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean he's doing that in like the worst. I mean, North Dakota would not be a fun place to farm.
No,
it just wouldn't. I mean,
no.
Wisconsin is a pretty, Southwest Wisconsin here is a great place. Southern Wisconsin is a great place, really, as long as you stay out of the pine belt or the pine forest and stuff. But you go down to Iowa, Missouri, those places and do things like this, the results are even better.
Yeah. So that puts that into perspective, right?
It's like, that's crazy.
When you have a guy who, a philanthropist,
because he could be working on making a tool that would measure carbon.
Yeah. Significantly faster.
that's the big thing we're missing for farmers now. It's like if we could incentivize farmers and we had a tool to measure the amount of carbon being sequestered into the soil, and all of a sudden the government could do what the government does essentially and run how agricultural practices are being done and say, hey, we are actually going to pay farmers who are doing things responsibly and sequestering carbon because we have this tool.
Yeah. No,
That's the thing that's missing right now.
I think that's where we need to go, right? It's not about,
it's happening. Like people are working on it, but it's just, if you had Bill Gates who can just make a carbon sequester machine out of nowhere, if he'd have just spent that energy on a measuring tool, which would then incentivize people to do things a different way. Not to mention the government always wants to subsidize stuff. That would be a great thing to subsidize.
Yeah.
Could you imagine if we were subsidizing carbon sequestration
instead of why would we do that when we can promote corn and beans to be grown with
at some point we do. At some point, even these freaks need to realize that there needs to be an earth that can be even lived on at some point. But they also, it's the instant gratification. We're going to get really, really rich while we're on this earth.
Yeah. No, it's depressing. So I guess we can.
I will say this in a more positive note. These things are changing for the better. My whole world is encompassed with this type of work and people that are getting into this and people who are discovering it at all times. This podcast will help, but there is positive things happening, and we are not to the point of no return. We are moving that direction.
Correct.
But I mean, we're not to that point. So
there's so much that can be done. And that's, again, that's why with my business, like I primarily work with recreational properties and hunters and managing that land. And the big reason for that is that, those are people that are open to land management because they want to benefit from it on the wildlife side of things. Right. And then I expose them to all this other information on how they could manage their land for not just more profit down the road, but also better improvement, or improve that land for future generations, better practices that are more sustainable. But they're not the only people that have a role in this, and farmers aren't the only ones that have a role or a stake in this. Every single homeowner that has a lawn could be doing more to put more carbon in the ground, could be doing more to produce more food, could be doing more to keep more chemicals and impurities out of the natural ecosystems, out of your water, out of the air, all these things. All these issues that we come across they're broad scale. It's not just this or that. For someone to sit at home and bitch about farmers or complain about hunters killing wildlife or whatever they're complaining about, but then they go mow a big yard and put a bird feeder out, and they think that their contribution to nature is feeding birds a bunch of corn or seed that were farmed by the very farmers that they're complaining about in a monoculture, and they're sprayed with the same chemicals, and then you bring them to your bird feeder. I mean, I've never seen organic bird feed advertised. I'm sure you could buy it, but it's not something that's popular. But that's despite what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is just, we can all do better. Right. So
yeah, we can.
I think we need to wrap up. But I want to leave everyone with a weekly tip, and again, the purpose of this podcast is to have these conversations and try and provoke some thought and kind of share our perspective and the things that we're seeing in the world, in our professions, because this is what we're doing from a career standpoint. But there's a lot of things, I made a big change in my life years ago. And it was dramatically amplified when I had kids, because I just started to look at everything, every aspect of, every aspect of my life, and make sure that I was doing the best thing that I possibly could for my kids, instead of, feeding them something that you're going to find out is terrible for them down the road, teaching them teaching them a mindset or work ethic or anything that's not going to be productive for them in the future. I started really digging into that stuff. So yeah, what I want to do with these podcasts is every week, I just want to share one tip from me personally, something that you can work on to improve, your life, to improve the planet. And the reality is, if you want to save the world, you have to start at home, right? You have to start with yourself and the things that you're doing. Start with your family, uh, branch out to your yard, to your community, to your local government, everything, right? But you got to start small. So before you go out and start putting signs together to picket some bill that was passed or whatever it might be, you got to look at the things that you're doing. So my tip, this week is on the food topic, and it's up to this generation to get this thing turned around. Taylor, you just said we're not at the point of no return. I would add yet to the end of that sentence. We will reach a point where we are at the point of no return. So we need to turn it around before it gets that far, right? And I think the biggest thing is shifting the mindsets of this next generation, i.e., our children. But more importantly, is waking up to this shit before it's too late for our kids, before we have even higher increase in obesity and all these diseases that never really existed until just a handful of years ago, and cancers and all that stuff, right? Like, we don't want to see this next generation deal with all that stuff. We want to put them in the best position possible. So with this food thing, we got to turn this around. And how do we turn this around? The power lies with the money, how the people spend their money. You don't have to be rich to have that power, right? It's what you're buying on a daily basis, what you're consuming, what you're putting in the fridge for your family to consume. Your money dictates where this food comes from. And there's a lot of options out there now. And that's the beauty of living in a free country in the society that we have. Though flawed, obviously very flawed, we still have options. It just comes down to money. So my tip right now is spend your money on food that's worth spending money on, plain and simple. I get it. Times are tough right now. A lot of people are strapped for cash, but there's never been a better time to hunker down and focus on the essentials. And the most essential thing in your life is your food. And honestly, food should be expensive. It should be expensive. You shouldn't be budgeting your life around your cell phone bill or your Netflix bill or whatever screen you're spending time staring at. You should budget around your future, and your future is the food that you're eating, the food that you're putting in your body. And when you support people that farm in ways that are healthy for the planet, that are also producing healthy food, the two are synonymous, really, then you're supporting those industries, and eventually they will take over the industries that are destroying the planet and producing shitty food. So again, food should be expensive. Support those companies, and things are going to get better, but start small. If you have a certain food item in your house that you consume a lot of, that's where I would start. Because one, if you're consuming a food item often, if it's full of not so good stuff, then you're just consuming a lot more of that not so good stuff, right? So start with something and go from there. Cut your budget in other places. Don't cut your budget with your food.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't have said that better myself.